You don't deserve to sit here, old man.
It's sad when the young generation like you act like that.
Someone poured coffee on a sleeping veteran. Minutes later, everyone found out who he really was. The morning rush at the Daily Grind Cafe had settled into its familiar rhythm when 68-year-old David Miller shuffled through the front door, his weathered work boots making soft sounds against the worn wooden floor. His graying head was uncovered, revealing the deep lines etched by decades of hard work and harder memories, and his faded red flannel shirt bore the wrinkles of a man who had just finished another grueling night shift at the warehouse. David's routine was as predictable as sunrise. After working 12 hours loading trucks to support his disabled daughter Sarah and her 2 young children, he would stop at the Daily Grind for a single cup of black coffee, his only luxury in a life stripped down to bare necessities. The small purple heart pin on his collar caught the morning light as he made his way to his usual corner booth, the one that gave him a clear view of all entrances and exits. Mrs. Peterson, the cafe owner who had served coffee to 3 generations of veterans, watched David settle into his seat with the quiet understanding of someone who recognized the signs. She had lost her own brother in Afghanistan and knew that some warriors never truly came home even when their bodies made it back to American soil. David's eyes were heavy with exhaustion as he sipped his coffee, the warmth spreading through his chest like a small comfort in a world that had grown increasingly cold toward men like him. The booth's cracked vinyl cushions had molded to his frame over the months of these post-shift visits, and despite his military training that taught him never to let his guard down completely, the familiar surroundings allowed him a moment of rest. Across the cafe, 21-year-old Ethan Reed held court with his fraternity brothers, their expensive clothes and confident laughter, marking them as products of privilege and entitlement. Ethan's father owned Reed Logistics, one of the city's most successful shipping companies, and the young man had never known want or struggle. His world was one of easy answers and easier judgments. "Look at this place," Ethan said loudly, gesturing around the cafe with theatrical disgust. "It used to be decent, but now it's full of homeless people ruining our hangout spot." His eyes fixed on David, who had finally succumbed to exhaustion and dozed off in his corner booth, his graying head resting against the window. To Ethan, David represented everything distasteful about the changing neighborhood, an unwashed reminder of failure and decline that had no place in his carefully curated world. What Ethan didn't know was that the homeless man sleeping in the corner booth was about to change his life forever. Ethan's friends laughed nervously at his commentary, but their discomfort was evident. While they shared his privileged background, most of them possessed enough basic decency to feel uneasy about mocking a sleeping stranger. But Ethan, emboldened by what he perceived as his audience's approval, decided to escalate his performance. "Watch this," Ethan announced, standing up from his table with the swagger of someone who had never faced real consequences for his actions. "I'm going to make a statement about the kind of clientele this place attracts." He walked to the counter and ordered a large coffee extra hot, his intentions clear to anyone paying attention. The young barista behind the counter looked uncomfortable, but was too intimidated by Ethan's aggressive confidence to question his order or his obvious plans. David remained asleep in his booth, his body finally relaxing after another night of physical labor that would have challenged men half his age. His breathing was deep and even the sleep of someone whose body demanded rest regardless of the circumstances. The Purple Heart pin on his collar caught the light as his chest rose and fell, a small testament to sacrifices that the cafe's morning customers couldn't begin to imagine. Mrs. Peterson was in her back office reviewing inventory and preparing for the lunch rush. She had always made it a point to let David rest undisturbed, understanding that his post-shift visits were about more than just coffee. They were about finding a small pocket of peace in a world that had become increasingly hostile to veterans like him. Ethan approached David's table with theatrical stealth, his friends watching with a mixture of anticipation and growing unease. He held the steaming cup of coffee like a weapon, his face twisted with the cruel satisfaction of someone about to inflict humiliation on a defenseless target. "Rise and shine, buddy," Ethan said loudly, then poured the scalding coffee directly over David's head. The cafe fell into shocked silence as the hot liquid soaked through David's hair and ran down his face, staining his flannel shirt and pooling on the table. David jerked awake with the instinctive alertness of a combat veteran, his body immediately assessing threats and escape routes, even as his mind struggled to process what had just happened. The physical pain of the hot coffee was immediate and intense, but it was nothing compared to the emotional devastation of public humiliation. David's hands moved automatically to wipe the coffee from his face, his movements careful and controlled despite the chaos of the moment. "There," Ethan announced to the silent cafe, his voice filled with satisfied cruelty. "Maybe now you'll find somewhere more appropriate to take your naps." David's combat instincts screamed at him to respond with force to neutralize the threat that had just attacked him. His body tensed with muscle memory from a dozen firefights, but his mind, shaped by decades of discipline and the wisdom that comes from seeing real enemies, recognized that Ethan was not a combatant, just a cruel child who had never learned respect. The other customers watched in stunned silence, their morning routine shattered by this act of casual cruelty. Some pulled out their phones to record, others whispered among themselves, but no one moved to help the man who sat dripping with coffee and dignity in equal measure. David slowly reached for the napkins on his table, his movements deliberate and controlled. As he cleaned the coffee from his face, his mind drifted to his daughter Sarah, confined to her care facility, and his grandchildren who looked up to him as their hero. The thought of them seeing him like this, humiliated and helpless, cut deeper than any physical wound he had ever received. As David methodically cleaned the coffee from his face and hair, his mind traveled back 15 years to a dusty street in Fallujah, where he had pulled a wounded Marine from a burning Humvee while enemy fire rained down around them. The contrast between that moment of heroism and this moment of humiliation was almost too much to bear. Ethan, meanwhile, was basking in what he perceived as his triumph. "Maybe next time you'll think twice about using a respectable establishment as your personal bedroom," he continued, his voice carrying across the silent cafe. His fraternity brothers had grown increasingly uncomfortable with the escalation, but none possessed the courage to challenge their leader. They shifted nervously in their seats, avoiding eye contact with David while trying to distance themselves from Ethan's cruelty without openly opposing him. David's father had taught him that a man's character was revealed not in how he handled victory, but in how he responded to disrespect and adversity. "Son," his father had said during David's troubled teenage years, any fool can throw a punch. It takes a real man to know when not to." Those words echoed in David's mind as he fought the urge to show Ethan exactly what a Marine was capable of when pushed too far. Instead, he continued cleaning himself with quiet dignity, his actions speaking louder than any words could have. It was then that Sofia Rodriguez, a middle-aged woman who worked as a secretary at the local VA office, approached David's table. She had been sitting across the cafe working on her laptop before her shift and had witnessed the entire incident with growing horror and rage. "Sir, are you all right?" Sophia asked, her voice gentle, but her eyes blazing with fury as she looked at Ethan. What this young man did is assault, and it's completely unacceptable. Sophia had spent years working with veterans, and she recognized the signs immediately, the way David held himself. The controlled breathing, the automatic threat assessment that never fully shut off. She also noticed the purple heart pin, now stained with coffee, but still proudly displayed. "I'm fine, ma'am," David replied quietly, his voice steady despite the humiliation burning in his chest. "Just a little wet?" But Sophia wasn't satisfied with that response. She pulled out her phone and made a call, her voice low but urgent as she spoke to someone on the other end. "Robert, it's Sophia. I need you to come to the daily grind right now. We have a situation with a veteran who's been assaulted. Yes, I'm serious. Just get here." Ethan, who had been enjoying his moment of perceived triumph, began to sense that the dynamic in the cafe was shifting. The other customers were no longer just passive observers. They were beginning to look at him with disgust rather than amusement. "What's your problem, lady?" Ethan demanded of Sophia. "It's just some homeless guy who was sleeping in a business. I was doing everyone a favor." Sophia's response was ice cold. "That homeless guy is a United States Marine veteran, you ignorant child, and what you just did constitutes assault." Mrs. Peterson chose that moment to emerge from her back office, drawn by the unusual silence in her normally bustling cafe. When she saw David sitting soaked with coffee and Sophia standing protectively beside him, her Irish temper flared to life. "What in the hell happened here?" Mrs. Peterson demanded, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had run a successful business for 30 years. "This young man," Sophia said, pointing at Ethan, "poured hot coffee over this veteran while he was sleeping, deliberately." Mrs. Peterson's face went through several shades of red as she processed what she was hearing. She had always prided herself on creating a safe space for veterans, a place where they could find a moment of peace and respect. The violation of that sanctuary was personal. "You did what?" Ms. Peterson's voice was dangerously quiet as she advanced on Ethan, who suddenly found himself facing the full fury of a woman who had buried too many young men in flag-draped coffins. Ethan's bravado began to crumble under the weight of Mrs. Peterson's rage and the growing hostility of the other customers. "Look, it was just a joke. The guy was sleeping in your cafe like it was a homeless shelter." "That man," Mrs. Peterson said, her voice shaking with emotion, "has been coming here for months. He works nights to support his disabled daughter and her children. He's never caused trouble, never asked for anything but a cup of coffee and a quiet place to rest. And you attacked him like some kind of animal." The cafe's atmosphere had completely transformed. What had begun as a cruel prank was now being recognized for what it truly was, an assault on a man who had already sacrificed more than most people could imagine. Outside the sound of approaching vehicles, could be heard suggesting that Sophia's phone call was about to bring consequences that Ethan had never anticipated. The first person through the cafe door was Colonel Robert Chen, a retired Marine Corps officer in his 50s who now worked as a veterans advocate. His perfectly pressed business suit couldn't hide the military bearing that marked him as a man accustomed to command and decisive action. Sophia's call had reached him just as he was leaving his office, and he had dropped everything to respond. Colonel Chen's eyes immediately found David taking in the coffee-stained shirt, the wet hair, and the quiet dignity with which the older Marine was handling his humiliation. Then his gaze shifted to Ethan, and the temperature in the cafe seemed to drop several degrees. "Sophia," Colonel Chen said quietly, "explain to me exactly what happened here." Before Sophia could respond, Officer Michael Peterson, Mrs. Peterson's nephew and a veteran of the Iraq War himself, entered the cafe. He had been on patrol nearby when his aunt called, her voice shaking with rage as she described the assault on one of her regular customers. Ethan, who had been growing increasingly uncomfortable with the escalating situation, tried to reassert control. "Look, this is getting blown way out of proportion. It was just a prank. Nobody got seriously hurt." Colonel Chen's response was measured but deadly serious. "Son, what you call a prank, the law calls assault. What you call harmless, I call an attack on a man who has served his country with honor." The colonel approached David's table, his demeanor shifting from authoritative to respectful. "Marine, I'm Colonel Chen, retired. Are you injured? Do you need medical attention?" David looked up at the colonel, recognizing the bearing and respect of a fellow warrior. "No, sir, I'm fine. Just a little embarrassed." "You have nothing to be embarrassed about," Colonel Chen replied firmly. "The embarrassment belongs entirely to the young man who attacked you." It was at this moment that the cafe door burst open again, and Richard Reed rushed inside, his face pale and his hands shaking. Ethan's father had received a frantic call from one of his son's friends who had finally found the courage to report what had happened. "Ethan!" Richard called out, his voice filled with panic and confusion. "What the hell is going on? Someone said you poured coffee on a veteran." Ethan, seeing his father's arrival as potential salvation, immediately began trying to minimize the situation. "Dad, it's not as bad as they're making it sound. It was just some old guy sleeping in the cafe, and I—" Richard's eyes found David across the cafe, and the color drained completely from his face. His legs seemed to give out slightly, and he had to steady himself against a nearby table. "Oh my God," Richard whispered, his voice barely audible. "David Sargent, David Miller." David looked up at the sound of his name, his eyes focusing on Richard's face with growing recognition. "Reed, Richard Reed, from the 2nd Marine Expeditionary Unit." The cafe fell into absolute silence as the two men stared at each other across 15 years and a lifetime of experiences. Richard began walking slowly toward David's table, his eyes filling with tears. "Ethan," Richard said, his voice breaking, "do you know who this man is? Do you have any idea what you've done?" Ethan looked between his father and David, confusion and growing dread evident on his face. "Dad, what are you talking about? It's just some homeless guy." Richard reached David's table and, to everyone's amazement, dropped to one knee beside the booth. "Sergeant Miller, I can't believe it's you after all these years." "What's going on?" Ethan demanded, his voice rising with panic as he began to understand that his world was about to change dramatically. Richard looked up at his son, tears streaming down his face. "This man, this homeless guy you just humiliated, saved my life in Iraq 15 years ago. He pulled me out of a burning Humvee while we were under enemy fire. I wouldn't be here, you wouldn't exist if not for Sergeant David Miller." The revelation hit the cafe like a physical force. Customers gasped. Ethan's friends backed away from him as if he had become toxic, and Mrs. Peterson began crying openly. The cruel prank had just been revealed as an attack on the man who had made Ethan's very existence possible. Ethan stood frozen, his face cycling through disbelief, horror, and dawning comprehension of the magnitude of what he had done. The silence in the daily grind was so complete that the sound of Richard Reed's tears hitting the floor seemed amplified. He remained kneeling beside David's booth, his successful businessman's composure completely shattered by the weight of recognition and shame. "Sergeant Miller," Richard continued, his voice thick with emotion. "It was March 15, 2009. Our convoy hit an IED outside Fallujah. My Humvee flipped and caught fire. I was trapped unconscious, and the fuel tank was about to blow." David's memory of that day was crystal clear, as were all his combat memories. "You were the radio operator," he said quietly. "Corporal Reed, you had a picture of your girlfriend taped to your helmet." "My wife now," Richard said, managing a weak smile through his tears. "We named our son after you, Ethan David Reed." The irony was devastating. Ethan had been named after the very man he had just humiliated, the hero who had risked his life so that Ethan could exist. Colonel Chen watched this reunion with professional interest and growing anger at what Ethan had done. Officer Peterson was already taking notes, preparing to file assault charges regardless of any personal connections that might emerge. Ethan himself stood paralyzed, his mind struggling to process the complete reversal of his understanding. The homeless loser he had attacked was not only a war hero, but the specific war hero who had saved his father's life and made his own privileged existence possible. "Dad," Ethan whispered, his voice barely audible, "I didn't know. How could I have known?" Richard stood up slowly, his business suit wrinkled and his face streaked with tears. When he turned to face his son, the disappointment in his eyes was more devastating than any physical blow could have been. "You didn't know because you never bothered to learn," Richard said, his voice gaining strength as his shock transformed into righteous anger. "You didn't know because you've lived your entire life assuming that anyone who doesn't look successful must be worthless." The climactic confrontation between father and son played out in front of the entire cafe, with David sitting quietly in the center of it all, still methodically cleaning coffee from his shirt. "Sergeant Miller," Richard said, turning back to David, "I've thought about you every day for 15 years. I've wondered where you were, how you were doing, whether you made it home safely. I've wanted to thank you, to repay you somehow." David's response was characteristic of his quiet dignity. "You don't owe me anything, Reed. We all did our jobs over there. I'm just glad you made it home to your family." "But I do owe you," Richard insisted. "I owe you everything. My life, my family, my success. None of it would exist without your courage." Mrs. Peterson had been listening to this exchange with growing amazement and sorrow. She approached David's table with a fresh cup of coffee and a clean towel, her Irish heart breaking for the injustice of what had happened. "On the house," she said, simply setting the coffee down. "And I want you to know that you'll always have a place here. Always." Colonel Chen had been making phone calls during the emotional reunion, and he approached the group with news that would change David's immediate circumstances. Sergeant Miller, the colonel said, "I've been in contact with several veterans organizations and the VA. What happened here today is unacceptable, but it's also going to result in some positive changes for you." Sofia Rodriguez, who had initiated the chain of events with her phone call, stepped forward with information she had gathered. "David, I've been reviewing your file. You're entitled to benefits you've never claimed, housing assistance you've never received, and medical care you've been going without." The climactic moment came when Richard Reed made a decision that would transform both David's life and his relationship with his son. "Sergeant Miller," Richard said, his voice firm with resolve, "I want to offer you a position with Reed Logistics, management-level full benefit salary that will let you take proper care of your daughter and grandchildren." David looked up at Richard with surprise. "Reed, I appreciate the gesture, but I don't need charity." "It's not charity," Richard replied firmly. "It's justice. It's 15 years overdue recognition for a debt I can never fully repay." Ethan watched this exchange with growing horror as he began to understand the full consequences of his actions. His father was not only offering David a job, but was clearly planning to hold his son accountable for the assault. "Dad," Ethan said desperately, "please, I'm sorry. I made a mistake." Richard turned to his son with an expression of cold disappointment. "You made a choice, Ethan. You chose cruelty over compassion, arrogance over respect, and now you're going to face the consequences of that choice." The café had become a courtroom where justice was being served not by law, but by the moral weight of truth and recognition. David, the victim of the assault, had been revealed as the hero whose sacrifice had made his attacker's life possible. Officer Peterson stepped forward to address the legal aspects of the situation. "Mr. Reed, regardless of any personal connections, your son committed assault. There will be charges filed." Colonel Chen added his own consequences. "And I'll be ensuring that every veterans organization in the state knows what happened here today." The climax had transformed a moment of cruelty into a reckoning that would reshape multiple lives and serve as a powerful lesson about the hidden heroes who walk among us, often unrecognized and unappreciated until circumstances reveal their true worth. 6 months after the coffee incident at the Daily Grind, the ripple effects continued to transform lives throughout the community. David Miller had accepted Richard Reed's job offer and was now the operations manager at Reed Logistics, earning enough to move his daughter Sarah to a better care facility and provide his grandchildren with opportunities he had never dreamed possible. "Every morning when I put on this suit," David would tell visitors to his new office, "I think about that day in the café. Sometimes the worst moments lead to the best changes." Ethan Reed had faced consequences that reshaped his understanding of privilege and responsibility. He had been terminated from his part-time position at his father's company, suspended from his fraternity, and required by the court to complete 200 hours of community service at the VA hospital. The experience of working with veterans had been transformative, teaching him lessons about service and sacrifice that no classroom could have provided. "I was an ignorant, entitled brat," Ethan would admit to the veterans he now served. "But Sergeant Miller's grace in forgiving me has given me a chance to become better." The Daily Grind had become an unofficial gathering place for veterans, with Mrs. Peterson establishing a Veterans Always Welcome policy that provided free coffee to any service member. A plaque near David's former corner booth read, "In honor of all who serve and in memory of the lesson learned here about recognizing heroes among us." Richard Reed had used his business connections to establish a foundation providing job placement services for veterans, with David serving as its director. The foundation had already placed over 100 veterans in meaningful employment, creating a network of support that extended far beyond a single act of recognition. Most significantly, the story of the coffee incident had spread through social media and news outlets, becoming a powerful reminder about the hidden heroes in every community. Schools began inviting David to speak about service and sacrifice, while his story was used in sensitivity training programs across the country. The real lesson, David would conclude his speeches, isn't about what happened to me that day. It's about looking at every person you meet and remembering that you might be standing next to someone who has sacrificed everything for your freedom. The veteran who had been humiliated by coffee had become a symbol of dignity, forgiveness, and the importance of recognizing the heroes who walk quietly among us, asking for nothing but deserving everything. This story demonstrates how moments of cruelty can be transformed into opportunities for recognition, justice, and positive change when the truth about hidden heroes is finally revealed.